Have you ever tried to explain your pain and somehow ended up apologizing for it? You came to talk about what hurt you, but minutes later, you were comforting them, explaining yourself, questioning your tone, feeling guilty for having emotions in the first place. And that is what makes emotional role reversal so dangerous, because it does not happen through screaming or threats or obvious manipulation. It happens quietly, through guilt, through confusion, through emotional pressure, until one day, you stop trusting your own reactions completely. At first, the pattern feels difficult to explain. You express discomfort. You try to communicate honestly. You explain something that hurts you, and almost immediately, their reaction changes the emotional direction, not toward resolution, toward their pain. They suddenly feel misunderstood, overwhelmed, hurt. And somehow, the conversation stops being about your emotions. It becomes about protecting theirs. And that shift changes relationships more than people realize. Because once emotional reactions replace accountability, clarity begins disappearing. You begin focusing on their sadness instead of your concern, their distress instead of your discomfort, their emotional state instead of the original issue. And slowly, you stop feeling emotionally safe to speak honestly. One of the clearest signs of emotional role reversal is how quickly guilt appears after honesty. You say something reasonable, something respectful, something calm, and instead of discussion, you feel emotional pressure. Not direct pressure, subtle pressure. The kind that makes you suddenly feel cruel for expressing normal emotions. You begin softening your words, reducing your honesty, explaining yourself too much. Not because your feelings disappeared, because their reaction made expression feel dangerous. Another powerful pattern begins appearing. When accountability becomes emotionally exhausting, every difficult conversation follows the same cycle. You explain discomfort. They react emotionally. You comfort them. The original issue disappears, and repeated unresolved conversations slowly train you to stay silent. Not because silence feels healthy, because communication feels emotionally expensive. Another important realization begins forming. When you notice how often you leave conversations confused instead of understood, you replay what happened afterward. You think about your tone, your wording, your timing. You search for mistakes, not obvious mistakes. Small ones, possible ones, imagined ones, and repeated self-analysis slowly weakens confidence, because emotionally manipulative dynamics rarely destroy certainty all at once. They reduce it gradually through repeated guilt, repeated confusion, repeated emotional redirection. Another disturbing pattern begins forming when your emotions begin feeling disruptive, not valid. Disruptive. You begin feeling guilty for having needs, guilty for expressing frustration, guilty for wanting accountability, and eventually, you stop expressing things naturally. You begin editing yourself before speaking, thinking carefully, softening reactions, reducing honesty, not because your emotions are wrong, because emotional reactions from them feel overwhelming. And that is where emotional imbalance quietly begins forming, because healthy communication allows space for both people to exist emotionally. But emotional role reversal changes that balance. One person expresses pain. The other person becomes responsible for managing it. And over time, you stop feeling like communicator. You start feeling like emotional caretaker. Another dangerous shift begins happening when their emotional reactions start controlling your behavior. You hesitate before bringing up problems, before setting boundaries, before disagreeing, not because boundaries disappeared, because reaction feels unpredictable. You anticipate sadness, withdrawal, distress, emotional shutdown, and anticipation creates silence, not external silence, internal silence, the kind that prevents honesty before conversations even begin. Another important realization begins forming when you notice how often you become the comforter instead of the person being heard. You came to express pain, but somehow you end up calming them down, reassuring them, explaining your intentions, apologizing for your emotions. And once that pattern repeats enough times, your nervous system begins associating honesty with guilt. That changes people deeply, because eventually you stop trusting emotional expression itself. Another powerful pattern begins appearing when their emotional pain always feels more urgent than yours. No matter what happened, their feelings become priority. Their sadness, their stress, their emotional reaction, and your original concern quietly disappears in the background. That is why emotional role reversal feels so psychologically exhausting, because your emotions never fully receive resolution. They get interrupted, redirected, replaced. Another subtle shift begins forming when self-doubt becomes automatic. You begin questioning your memory, your perception, your interpretation of events, not because reality changed, because emotional pressure changed your confidence. You remember what happened clearly, but after their emotional reaction, certainty starts fading. You begin wondering, maybe I misunderstood, maybe I overreacted, maybe I was too emotional. And repeated doubt slowly changes identity. You become more hesitant, more cautious, less expressive. Not because your personality changed, because confidence weakened. Another important realization begins forming when you recognize that emotional confusion can become control, not aggressive control, quiet control, the kind that shapes behavior through guilt. Because once someone feels responsible for another person's emotional stability, honesty becomes difficult, boundaries become difficult, accountability becomes difficult, and difficulty creates silence. Another meaningful pattern begins appearing when emotional reactions begin replacing discussion entirely. Instead of conversation, there is distress. Instead of accountability, there is sadness. Instead of resolution, there is emotional overwhelm. And overwhelming emotion often shuts conversations down before clarity appears. That is why emotional role reversal can feel impossible to explain to others. From the outside, nothing dramatic happened. No screaming, no threats, no visible cruelty, just confusion, repeated confusion, the kind that slowly changes how you see yourself. Another powerful shift begins happening when your confidence starts depending on their reactions. If they react calmly, you feel stable. If they react emotionally, you feel guilty. An emotional dependence quietly begins forming, not because you are weak, because repeated emotional pressure trained your nervous system to prioritize their reactions over your reality. That is why emotionally manipulative dynamics often create exhaustion without obvious conflict. Your body remains tense, even during normal conversations. You overthink wording, prepare emotionally before speaking, anticipate reactions before honesty, and constant anticipation creates emotional fatigue. Not visible fatigue, internal fatigue, the kind that makes communication feel draining. Another important realization begins forming when you notice how emotionally healthy people feel different Healthy people do not punish honesty. They do not make accountability feel cruel. They do not make emotional expression feel dangerous. You leave healthy conversations feeling clearer, safer, more understood, not guilty for speaking. And once you experience emotionally safe communication, role reversal becomes easier to recognize. You begin noticing the difference between emotion and emotional pressure, between sadness and emotional control, between vulnerability and manipulation. And awareness changes everything, because once patterns become visible, automatic guilt begins weakening. Another meaningful shift begins forming when you stop rushing to comfort emotional reactions immediately, not because empathy disappeared, because clarity became important too. You begin staying focused on the original issue, not allowing emotional reactions to completely redirect the conversation. And maintaining focus changes confidence. You stop apologizing automatically. You stop explaining yourself excessively. You stop treating normal emotional expression like wrongdoing. Another powerful realization begins forming when you understand that not every emotional reaction belongs to you. Not every sadness means you caused harm. Not every distress means you were cruel. Not every emotional response requires self-blame. And once that understanding becomes stronger, your confidence slowly begins returning. You begin trusting your perception again, your memory, your instincts, your emotional reactions, not blindly, carefully, respectfully. Another meaningful shift begins appearing when you stop measuring yourself through other people's emotional reactions. You begin asking different questions. Was I honest? Was I respectful? Was I clear? Instead of, did they become upset? Did they withdraw? Did they react emotionally? Because emotional reactions do not automatically define truth. Another important realization begins forming when you recognize that emotionally manipulative dynamics survive through confusion. If guilt appears quickly enough, clarity disappears. If emotional overwhelm becomes strong enough, accountability fades. And if accountability disappears long enough, control quietly begins forming. That is why awareness matters so much, because awareness interrupts emotional confusion. You begin pausing before apologizing, pausing before accepting guilt, pausing before assuming responsibility for every emotional reaction around you. And pause creates emotional stability, not emotional distance. Stability. Another disturbing realization begins forming when you notice how emotionally manipulative people often appear most vulnerable, exactly when accountability becomes unavoidable. The moment difficult conversations begin, their emotional reaction suddenly intensifies. They feel attacked, misunderstood, emotionally overwhelmed, and your attention immediately shifts, not toward the behavior, toward their pain. That emotional shift happens so quickly, you barely notice it, but your nervous system notices, because suddenly you stop focusing on your emotions and start managing theirs. Another powerful pattern begins appearing when emotional vulnerability becomes strategically timed, not random, timed. You notice how distress appears, exactly when responsibility becomes uncomfortable, exactly when boundaries become necessary, exactly when difficult truths enter the conversation. And over time, those emotional reactions begin training you emotionally. You start avoiding difficult conversations completely, not because the problems disappeared, because emotional consequences feel exhausting. Another meaningful shift begins forming when emotional manipulation begins changing your personality. You become quieter, more cautious, more emotionally restrained, not naturally, adaptively. You stop speaking freely, Stop reacting honestly. Stop expressing disappointment immediately. Because experience taught you that honesty creates emotional chaos, and repeated emotional chaos changes people slowly. Another important realization begins forming when you notice how often your emotional needs become secondary. You comfort them first, reassure them first, stabilize the situation first, and only afterward. If emotional space still exists, your emotions are briefly acknowledged, but relationships cannot stay emotionally healthy. When one person's feelings constantly dominate emotional space, eventually, the other person disappears emotionally, quietly, gradually. Another powerful shift begins happening when your emotional exhaustion starts becoming physical too. You feel drained after conversations, heavy after conflict, mentally tired after emotional discussions. Not because communication is bad, because emotional confusion consumes energy. Your mind constantly analyzes, what happened? What did I do wrong? Why do I suddenly feel guilty? And repeated emotional analysis creates psychological exhaustion. Another subtle pattern begins appearing when emotional reactions become more powerful than facts. You try explaining reality, specific behavior, specific words, specific actions, but emotional reactions overpower the conversation completely, and eventually, facts stop mattering. Only emotional pressure remains. That is why emotional role reversal feels so destabilizing, because reality becomes emotionally blurred. Another meaningful realization begins forming when you understand that some people unconsciously use victimhood to maintain emotional control, not always maliciously, but effectively, because victimhood creates sympathy. Sympathy reduces accountability, and reduced accountability protects behavior. That cycle can continue for years without obvious manipulation ever being recognized. Another important shift begins forming when you stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional honesty. Someone crying does not automatically mean they are truthful. Someone appearing hurt does not automatically mean they are innocent. And someone reacting emotionally does not automatically mean you caused harm. That realization changes emotional clarity deeply, because for the first time, you begin separating reaction from responsibility. Another powerful realization begins forming when you understand how emotionally manipulative dynamics often create dependency. Not through love, through uncertainty. You keep trying to explain yourself better, communicate more carefully, avoid upsetting them, prevent emotional reactions, and slowly, your emotional stability becomes dependent on keeping them emotionally comfortable. That is emotional imbalance, not connection. Another meaningful shift begins happening when you finally stop trying to earn emotional permission to express your own reality. You stop over-explaining pain, stop apologizing for boundaries, stop shrinking your emotions to protect someone else's reactions. And that changes confidence, because confidence returns when self-betrayal stops. Another important realization begins forming when you recognize that emotionally healthy people do not require you to abandon yourself emotionally to maintain peace. Healthy communication allows honesty without punishment, disagreement without emotional collapse, boundaries without guilt. And once you experience emotionally balanced communication, manipulative dynamics become impossible to ignore, because emotional safety feels completely different. It feels calm, not tense, not confusing, not emotionally exhausting. Calm. Another powerful shift begins happening when self-trust slowly starts returning. You stop second-guessing every reaction. You stop minimizing your discomfort automatically. You stop assuming your emotions are the problem. And once self-trust begins rebuilding, something important changes inside you. Your voice becomes steadier, not louder, steadier. You begin expressing thoughts more directly, setting boundaries more clearly, communicating without excessive apology, not aggressively, confidently. Because confidence does not come from controlling others. It comes from trusting yourself. Another meaningful realization begins forming when you understand that healthy communication never requires you to abandon your emotions completely. Healthy relationships make space for honesty, for accountability, for disagreement, for emotional reality, not just emotional reactions. And once you fully recognize that difference, your standards begin changing too. You stop normalizing confusion. You stop romanticizing emotional instability. You stop accepting guilt as automatic proof of wrongdoing. Instead, you begin valuing clarity, balance, mutual responsibility, emotional safety. And emotional safety changes everything. You stop fearing honesty. Stop fearing emotional expression. Stop fearing your own reactions, because your emotions finally stop feeling dangerous. Another important shift begins forming when you recognize that your emotional reality deserves space too. Not secondary space, real space. Space to express discomfort, space to ask questions, space to set boundaries, space to exist emotionally without immediate guilt. And once you stop shrinking emotionally, confidence begins returning naturally. Not dramatic confidence, quiet confidence, the kind that allows honesty without fear of emotional punishment. Another powerful realization begins forming when you understand that repeated emotional role reversal did not mean you were weak. It meant you adapted. You adapted to emotional unpredictability, to guilt, to confusion, to repeated pressure. But adaptation is not identity. And once awareness appears, patterns begin losing influence. Gradually, steadily, you begin recognizing emotional pressure faster, recognizing guilt sooner, recognizing when conversations shift away from accountability and toward emotional control. And recognition protects self-trust, not perfectly, but powerfully. So if any part of this felt familiar, if honesty often turned into guilt, if your emotions repeatedly became apology, if accountability somehow always transformed into sympathy, do not ignore that recognition, because awareness protects clarity, protects confidence, protects emotional stability. And once clarity becomes stronger than guilt, something important begins returning. Not control over others, control over yourself, your perception, your voice, your confidence, your emotional reality. And once self-trust returns, emotional manipulation begins losing its power, not instantly, but steadily, until one day, honesty no longer feels dangerous, and your voice finally feels like yours again.